Ever get like a weird extra heartbeat, like just a little blip in your chest,
Yep.
You probably just ignored it. Most people do. But what if I told you that that blip, it might not be so harmless after all?
That's right.
That's what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
We got a study, a textbook excerpt, and a journal article all about a heart rhythm called AIVR.
That's right. And I'm a cardiologist, and I actually specialize in all these weird heart rhythms. And you've hit on something pretty interesting here. AIVR, that stands for Accelerated Idioventricular Rhythm. By the way, it's usually, pretty harmless. It's like finding a mismatched slake in the laundry. It's a little odd, but no big deal.
Exactly. But you're saying it's not always nothing to worry about.
Exactly.
Okay, now you got me interested. Give me the lowdown on AIVR. What is actually going on in the heart when this happens?
So imagine your heart's electrical system, right? It's like an orchestra.
Okay.
The sinus node is like the conductor. It keeps everything in sync, nice rhythm.
Right.
But with AIVR, the lower chambers of your heart, the ventricles, they kind of get a little ahead of themselves. It's like the percussion section deciding to just go rogue. So it's an extra beat, but it's coming from the wrong place.
So instead of a nice smooth symphony, you get like a drum solo out of nowhere.
Precisely. Now, a single offbeat drum hit, no big deal. But the Wang study that you sent, that's where things get a little bit more interesting. They found that sometimes those rogue drummers, they just keep going.
Okay.
And it can actually start causing some problems. And we call that frequent AIVR.
Okay. Frequent AIVR. So how frequent are we talking here? And what kind of problems could it actually cause? Don't leave me hanging.
So we're talking about spending a significant chunk of the day, think like 70% or more, with your heart doing this little offbeat rhythm. Imagine that drum solo, but it's going on for hours.
Yeah.
Not exactly music to your ears, is it?
Definitely not. What would that even feel like?
Well, imagine that feeling of your heart skipping a beat, but it's happening all the time. People often describe it as palpitations, fluttering, or pounding in their chest.
Right.
Some even experience chest discomfort, dizziness, or even fainting, especially during exercise.
Fainting. Now, that's not just an offbeat drum anymore. That's a whole health hazard. This is really interesting. I had no idea
Yeah.
that these rogue drummers could be causing so much trouble.
And that's why this research is so important, because it's really challenging that traditional view of AIVR as always being benign.
Yeah. So we're learning that frequent AIVR can be a much bigger deal than we once thought. But the million-dollar question is, if it's more than just a harmless blip, what can you actually do about it?
That's where things get even more interesting. And that's what we'll dive into next.
All right, so we've established that frequent AIVR can be a real problem, but what can you actually do about it? The stuff you sent me mentions something called catheter ablation. Is that like hitting the reset button on your heart's electrical system?
Well, it's a little more nuanced than a simple reset, but yeah, you're on the right track. Catheter ablation is a procedure where we use heat or cold energy to make these tiny little scars in your heart.
Yeah.
And basically these scars interrupt the faulty electrical pathways that are causing all those rogue drum beats.
Okay, so not exactly open heart surgery, but still a pretty big deal.
Right.
The textbook excerpt you sent seemed to focus more on AIVR happening after a heart attack.
Yeah.
Is there a connection there to this whole ablation thing?
Yeah, that's a great point. So after someone has a heart attack, during the recovery period, the heart can be kind of electrically unstable.
Right.
And this instability, it can sometimes trigger AIVR. Now, in most cases, it's temporary and it resolves on its own. But for some people, especially those with that frequent AIVR and maybe some other underlying risk factors, catheter ablation, it might be recommended to kind of prevent future episodes.
So it's like giving those rogue drummers a timeout, especially after a major event like a heart attack.
Exactly.
To keep them from causing too much trouble.
Exactly. Now, the journal article you sent, the one by Gildea and Levi's, they really go deeper into the electrical intricacies of AIVR, and they talk about something called AV dissociation.
Right. I remember seeing that term. It sounds a little intimidating, like your heart's filing for divorce from itself.
Thankfully, it's not quite that dramatic. Think of it this way. Your heart has two main pacing centers. There's the upper chambers, the atria, and the lower chambers, the ventricles. And normally they work together, nice harmony.
Right.
But with AV dissociation, they're kind of doing their own thing. It's like two separate conductors trying to lead the same orchestra.
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see how things can get a little offbeat in that scenario.
Exactly.
But why should our listener care about all this electrical jargon? What's the takeaway message here?
The key takeaway here is, if you are experiencing those symptoms, those telltale signs, frequent palpitations, chest discomfort, Any dizziness, any fainting, don't ignore it.
Yeah.
It's really important to talk to your doctor, especially if you have a history of heart problems or any other risk factors, like maybe an electrolyte imbalance. Just go get it checked out.
So knowledge is power, right? The more you know about your own heart health, the better you are to advocate for yourself. Speaking of knowledge, this deep dive has been really, really helpful. Before we wrap things up, are there any other little nuggets of wisdom you think our listeners should know about from these sources? We've covered a lot of ground today, from rogue drum solos to like giving those rogue drummers a timeout. But before we let you go, any final advice for our listeners from these sources we looked at today?
You know, one thing that stood out to me was the mention of AIVR in athletes.
Oh, yeah, right. The textbook mentioned that. You'd think athletes would have like the most in-sync orchestras around. What's going on there?
Well, you know, even a well-conducted orchestra can still have a rogue musician every now and then.
That's true.
Athletes, their hearts work incredibly hard, and sometimes that can just lead to a little electrical hiccup.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that even if you're healthy, it's still important to, listen to your body and speak up if something feels off.
So true. And don't be afraid to ask questions, even if you think you're, worried about nothing.
Right.
We learned today that a supposedly benign blip can sometimes be more than meets the eye.
Absolutely. And, your question, it might spark a whole new line of research.
Yeah.
Maybe even uncover a new treatment option. Never underestimate the power of curiosity.
That is such a good point. Well, this has been incredible. We went from AIVR as just kind of like a weird thing to understanding its real impact on your health. A huge thank you to our expert for sharing your expertise and, making cardiology so captivating.
It's been a pleasure, really. Fascinating conversation.
And to you, our listener, thank you for, sending us down this fascinating rabbit hole. We love exploring these medical mysteries with you. Remember, knowledge is power when it comes to your health, so keep those questions coming. And until next time, stay curious.